So this evening's program is part of a special series for the Mercer Museum's current exhibit, 200 Years of Bucks County Art. The exhibit highlights local portraiture and landscape paintings by noted American artists and important regional painters. It then pairs those paintings with historical artifacts, documents, and images from the Bucks County Historical Society collection. We are excited to have the exhibit on display at the museum through the end of this year, and I would like to take a minute to also give a special thank you to the exhibit's sponsors: Univest, Visit Bucks County, Tom Thomas, Gratz Gallery and Conservation Studio, Penn Color, Susan E. Kane, Kathleen F. O'Day and Lawrence Grimm Jr., and Brian and Louise McLeod. We truly could not have this exhibit without our sponsors, and we are very grateful for their support. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker to you, Dr. Laura Turner Igoe. Dr. Igoe is the Curator of American Art at the James A. Michener Art Museum, our wonderful neighbors across Pine Street. She specializes in American art and material culture of the long 19th century and has held curatorial and research positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Princeton University Art Museum, Harvard Art Museums, and the Barnes Foundation. At the Michener Museum, she has curated the 2019 exhibit Impressionism to Modernism, the Lenfest Collection of American Art, and the museum's current exhibit, Rising Tides, Contemporary Art and the Ecology of Water. Tonight, we will hear about Bucks County artist Edward Hicks, and specifically his painting, William Penn's Treaty with the Lenape Indians. I hope you enjoy our talk this evening, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Igoe.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Olivia, for that introduction. And I'm so happy to be here with our good friends, the Mercer Museum. Let me bring up my screen. Okay, so I am currently located in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, and the Michener and Mercer Museums are in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which are all part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Lenape people. I want to pay respect to Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout Lenape diaspora. So if you're familiar with the Michener Art Museum and its collection, you may be surprised actually that I am not presenting on Pennsylvania Impressionism, which is what the museum is arguably best known for. And I certainly was tempted. When visiting the exhibition, 200 Years of Bucks County Art, I was pretty much blown away by this gigantic painting by William Lathrop of Hip Roof House, one of New Hope's earliest homes. The artist made this work for Doylestown 1912 Old Home Week and County Seat Centennial, and I'm showing you an image. You can see sort of to the image on the right, a little bit to the right on the side, there is an image of this painting being carried in a parade to celebrate the centennial. It's really hard for me to resist paintings that were carried in parades, and I really want to learn more about this work, so perhaps a future talk. But even though I work at an institution with a strong collection of 20th century and contemporary art, my research background is actually in late 18th and early 19th century art history. In choosing my topic for this presentation this evening, I was inspired by the early founders and presidents of the Bucks County Historical Society and their keen awareness that art is instrumental in the documentation and visualization of history. This belief, which directed many of the Society's commissions and collecting practices, prompts important questions. So whose history is visualized, preserved, and celebrated, and how does this impact our understanding of the past today? This question encouraged me to revisit past research I conducted on visualizations of William Penn's treaty with the Indians in the late 18th and early 19th century. My presentation today will take a closer look at Edward Hicks's Penn's Treaty with the Indians in the Mercer Museum's collection, unpack the visual history of this image, and critically interrogate its message in the first half of the 19th century. While broadcasting Quaker ideals and beliefs for the artist and the recipients of his paintings, Hicks's paintings of Penn's treaty also attempted to rewrite the fraught history of Native and Anglo-American conflict by substituting it with a powerful and appealing myth of peaceful coexistence. Born in Langhorne, Pennsylvania in 1780, Edward Hicks is best known today for his multiple paintings of the peaceable kingdom. And here I'm showing you the Mercer's version of that subject on the left, along with a portrait of Hicks painted by his cousin Thomas, with a hint of a peaceable kingdom composition in the lower left corner. You can kind of barely make it out. So I can circle that with my mouse there. And this painting is in the Michener Art Museum's collection. So just come on over across the street to see it. It's on view right now in our galleries. Hicks learned the art of painting while decorating coaches as a coachmaker's apprentice. This led him to eventually paint household objects, farm equipment, and signs. And here are two signboards in the Mercer's collection that are on display in the 200 Years of Bucks County Art exhibition. And I have to show you my favorite Hicks sign, which advertises Henry Van Horn's carpenter services, from the cradle to the grave. After a self-described wayward lifestyle as a young man, Hicks joined the Society of Friends in 1803 and became a Quaker minister about a decade later. Decorative painting, however, was antithetical to Quaker beliefs in simplicity and plain utilitarian living. Although he unsuccessfully attempted farming for a short period, Hicks never totally gave up his chosen vocation. He wrote many years later in his memoirs that his nature, quote, presented formidable obstacles to the attainment of that truly desirable character, a consistent and exemplary member of the Religious Society of Friends, one of which is an excessive fondness for painting, end quote. So he loved to paint, and he was unable to give that up, even though he had these very strong religious beliefs. Hicks was not the only Quaker towing the line of material possession and plainness and utilitarianism. Many wealthy Quakers in Philadelphia also decorated their homes with the latest fashions and sat for portraits by some of the preeminent painters of the day. So as far as we know, easel paintings were not a significant part of Hicks's business, despite the number of works that survive today. And when I say easel paintings, I'm talking about paintings like Peaceable Kingdom, so not the signs and other kind of, decorative objects that he decorated through painting, but paintings that he made on an easel. It is believed that he made these paintings primarily for his friends and other Quakers who had a close relationship with Hicks's ministry. Many do not appear in extant shop records, so he may not have even received compensation for many of them, and instead distributed them as gifts. Several of the Hicks paintings at the Mercer, including the Peaceable Kingdom shown here, were acquired by Abraham Chapman, a lawyer and friend of the artist. Chapman sold Hicks a house in Newtown in 1810, and then rented a room back from him, so they even lived together for a while. In Hicks's account book, which is also on display in the Mercer exhibition, Chapman's entry lists the purchase of 2 landscape paintings for $30, which is a very rare recording of an easel painting sale for Hicks. As Hicks attempted to negotiate his religion and his chosen occupation, he recalled advice, quote, given to me by my old friend Abraham Chapman. Edward, thee has now the source of independence within thyself and thy particular talent for painting. Keep to it within the bounds of innocence and usefulness, and thee can always be comfortable, end quote. So Chapman is encouraging Edward to keep painting because he has the talent, and he argues that if Edward Hicks keeps to innocent and useful subjects like the religious paintings that he was producing, he can always be comfortable, so always have an income. The Chapman paintings, including Penn's treaty with the Indians, which was given to Chapman's daughter, descended in the family to Henry Chapman Mercer, Abraham Chapman's great-grandson and the Mercer Museum's founder. Mercer, as I'm sure most of you know, was deeply interested in pre-industrial tools and design and folk culture, so Hicks's lack of formal training and close connection to the decorative arts undoubtedly appealed to him. Hicks used his easel paintings to visually explore and express his religious beliefs and engage in ongoing debates within the Quaker community. Hicks created his paintings when there was tension between 2 factions of Quakers. So the Hicksites, who rallied around, Hicks's cousin Elias Hicks, who was also a minister, believed in the importance of one's inner light in guiding individual faith. Orthodox Quakers, on the other hand, upheld the spiritual authority of the Bible and wished for a greater connection to British Quakers. Scholars have argued that Hicks's Peaceable Kingdom paintings are centered around ideas of peace between these two factions. These works illustrate the passage from the biblical book of Isaiah, quote, "The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf with the young lion, and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them," end quote. Hicks' visualization of this passage expresses the denial of self-will communicated through inner light as a means of establishing harmonious coexistence. Hicks believed that Pennsylvania's Quaker founder, William Penn, exemplified spiritual freedom as the foundation of civil liberty, and he began incorporating Penn's treaty with the Indians in his Peaceable Kingdoms early on, and I think you can see that to the left of this Peaceable Kingdom image. He also painted approximately 14 standalone Penn's treaties with the Penn's treaty with the Indians in the 1830s and 40s. And then here I'm just showing you a couple examples, one from the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Center in Colonial Williamsburg, and another from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In the Mercer Museum's Penn's treaty, a number of Quakers in dark tri-corner hats meet with a group of Indians in various states of dress. In the center left of the group, two merchants present a bolt of red cloth to the Lenape, who appear to be considering its merits. William Penn stands in the center with his arms outspread, gesturing to an unrolled piece of parchment with his left hand, and the bolts of fabric with his right. A series of buildings rise in the background, denoting the European settlement that is already underway. The seated Lenape figure at the left holds a still smoking pipe in his left hand, you can see that here, emphasizing the diplomatic nature of the meeting. Two figural groupings, here and here, bookend the central scenes in the foreground. So to the right are two colorfully dressed merchants who lounge on crates of their merchandise immediately in front of the harbor, which is populated by a couple ships. And in the left foreground over here, a Lenape woman nurses her child wrapped to a cradle board, while another woman next to her gestures to the central exchange. The veneered frame with its raised corner blocks is likely original to the piece, and it sports the gilded lettering here on the bottom saying Penn's Treaty that Hicks excelled in as a sign painter. Hicks copied this subject from the American-born artist Benjamin West, whose version became extremely popular soon after its completion in 1772. West painted Penn's treaty with the Indians at a time of great social, political, and economic instability in the British American colonies. Commissioned in late 1770 or early 1771 by Thomas Penn as a tribute to his late father, William Penn, the painting defended the rights of the Penn family when Benjamin Franklin and the Quaker-dominated Pennsylvania Assembly sought to disassemble the proprietary government. Thomas Penn intended for the painting to reassert his hereditary claim to Pennsylvania and rewrite his own history of less than ethical dealings with Lenape. West was, at the time, on the rise as one of the most preeminent painters in London. He was actually appointed historical painter to the royal court of King George III in 1772. West drew upon his own carefully crafted narrative of his youth spent in Pennsylvania when composing the painting. In his letters and biography, he positioned his encounters with Native Americans as a significant portion of his own creation myth. He traced his progression from, quote, participating in the amusements of the wigwams of American savages, and, quote, to, quote, the refinements of the royal palaces in Europe as an extensive scale in human progress, end quote. So West continually kind of played upon his, what he would call his primitive upbringing in Pennsylvania. West collected and owned Native American accessories and artifacts and reproduced them in paintings to preserve a sense of accuracy, and this painting is one example of that. And the painter even included portraits of his father and half-brother among the Quakers participating in the treaty. So this is Benjamin West's father here, and then his half-brother is right here behind Penn. Several scholars have highlighted West's anachronisms, distortions, and imperial iconography in this iconic painting, demonstrating that Penn's treaty with the Indians is more deeply entrenched in and concerned with the political and economic situation of the late 18th century than the actual occurrences of the late 17th century, when Penn's treaty was believed to have happened. The history of Penn's treaty is murky at best. Scholars have long debated when and where such an event took place, if it did in fact occur, and even what the contents of this treaty were. No specific document of the treaty, as depicted by West and Hicks, exists, but it is generally accepted that Penn and his agents conducted several meetings with the Lenape within the Pennsylvania colony in 1682 and 1683, soon after Penn's arrival. In 1733, Voltaire described Penn's agreement with the Lenape as, quote, the only treaty between those people and the Christians that was not ratified by oath and was never infringed, end quote. And I'll discuss the importance of that statement in a little bit. Even though the walking purchase of 1737, in which William Penn's heirs confiscated 1.2 million acres west of the Delaware River to sell to new settlers, and validated Voltaire's statement of this peaceful treaty, the myth of Penn's treaty persisted and even flourished by the late 18th and early 19th century. West's painting provided a concrete visual narrative for the event. Prior to his composition, visualizations of the treaty were scarce. And here's one example, which is the Richardson medal, which is believed to be the first Indian coin struck in the colonies. And it features a Quaker on the right and an Indian smoking a peace pipe at a council fire beneath a tree, kind of overshadowing them to the right. This medal was commissioned by the Friendly Association, a group of Pennsylvania Quakers that mediated negotiation between the Lenape and the Pennsylvania Assembly. As historian Andrew Newman has explained, West's painting substituted a tableau for his historical narrative, quote, exercising the power of a composed image over a verbal account that was, to use a visual metaphor, sketchy, end quote. West's painting very quickly became the de facto image for Penn's treaty. After it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in London in 1772, John Hall produced an engraving of the painting for the publisher John Boydell, which was disseminated throughout the Atlantic world. So this image essentially went viral as much as an image could in the late 18th century. It appeared on textiles and china and other printed material that could be purchased and consumed at a relatively low price. As a result, West's Penn's treaty popped up in a variety of unusual places. So in an illustrated book of American costumes published in Milan on the left, and this painting on metal by an unidentified artist in the Philadelphia Museum of Art's collection on the right. Hicks likely never saw West's painting in person and instead copied the widely circulated print by Hall. You can tell this because Hicks replicates the image's reversal resulting from the printing process. So Hall's print is kind of like the image is flipped from West's painting, because if someone was making an engraving, they would be working on a plate that would be pressed on a piece of paper, and the image would be reversed. But Hicks' painting replicates the same direction as the print does. Hicks almost always used engravings as source material for his easel paintings. For his first Peaceable Kingdom painting, he combined animals and the child figure from Charles Heath's illustrated Bible with the detail of the natural bridge in Virginia from Henry Tanner's 1822 map of North America. I think you can see pretty clearly how closely he stayed to his original sources when constructing this painting, just adding some more clothing to the child, for example. And what's happening under the natural bridge in this Hicks painting? A teeny tiny Penn's treaty, of course. So when composing his paintings, Hicks combined imagery from both religious and secular texts and sources, creating a very rich collage of visual references that period viewers of his work would likely have recognized. They probably would have seen some of these sources as well in printed material, so they would have known that Hicks's paintings were referencing these other sources. So why the mass appeal of this image, and why was it so appealing in particular to Hicks that he would regularly incorporate it into his Peaceable Kingdom paintings and paint over a dozen versions of the subject? The obvious answer is that Penn's treaty was a significant event in American Quaker history, and one that embodied the ideals of peace and spiritual independence that Hicks promoted in his sermons. For Quakers, Penn's treaty demonstrated the effectiveness of pacifism and justice in political and economic negotiations. By combining the Penn's treaty with Isaiah's peaceable kingdom, Hicks positioned the peaceful gathering of Penn, Quakers, and Native Americans, presenting both the savage and civilized to Anglo-American viewers, as prefiguring peace during the future reign of Christ, when, quote, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, end quote. So that Isaiah passage is imagining a future when Christ returns to earth. A couple of Hicks' later paintings directly reference Voltaire's 1733 description of Penn's agreement with the Lenape as, quote, made with, I'm sorry, I missed my wrong slide. So here are the a couple other versions of Penn's treaty that have text at the bottom that says that it was, sorry, mixed up in my, that it was made without an oath and never broken, the foundation of religious and civil liberty in the US of America. So this statement refers to a Quaker belief that binding an agreement under oath lessened obligations to be honest in everyday dealings. However, while the scroll, or we believe the treaty that is held by William Penn, is obscured by shadows and undecipherable. So here I'm talking about Penn is holding a scroll here, but you can't really see what it says. It's in shadow, it's dark. Hicks, however, highlights this document, moving it into the light and making the following words legible under closer inspection. So you can kind of make out, barely, I know, it says Penn's treaty with the Indians for Pennsylvania. So Hicks literally wrote a contract for Penn's treaty, even though no such historical document existed. Hicks also visually underscored the importance of Penn in this transaction. Where West placed Penn slightly left of center, again in shadow. So here is Penn, William Penn again here in this dark brown jacket. And making this, I think West makes this interesting choice of making actually this kneeling figure in green the central point of the painting. But Hicks moves his pen front and center, and he gives him brighter clothing, and he bathes him in much more light. So there's no doubt who the hero of this story is in Hicks' painting. Hicks also, interestingly, placed his scene at a physical remove from the viewer. What I mean by that is you'll notice kind of in the immediate foreground of the painting, it seems almost as if the ground just drops off precipitously, as if these figures are standing near a cavernous hole. There is no such feature in West's composition, so this is entirely Hicks' creation. He also employed this compositional device in his peaceable kingdom paintings, using these deep ravines that you see here to separate the illustration of the Isaiah passage, the peaceable kingdom passage, with the Penn's treaty figures in the background. So I've read some scholars that have argued that this denotes the crumbling and deterioration of the peaceful harmony these figural and animal groupings symbolized. I, however, propose that Hicks actually is perhaps looked to an art historical tradition of creating physical boundaries between earthly and spiritual realms. So did anyone think I would bring in Leonardo da Vinci? I don't know, but I did anyway. So Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Madonna and Child with St. Anne is just one example of there's many Renaissance paintings that do this, that use a similar device of a foreground ravine to remind visitors that these are holy figures that are separate from our own existence. And these paintings are made at a time when many religious figures were arguing about the danger of religious images as being problematic, and being that these spiritual figures should not be represented at all. So artists are coming up with these different tactics to show that these figures are not existing with us in our earthly realm. Hicks may also have intended to express to his Quaker patrons and friends who were highly skeptical of the fine arts that his scenes were also not of this world, but on a different spiritual plane. So there is another implicit message or goal of Hicks and West's images of Penn's treaty, and that is to firmly place the Lenape in the historical past. In the decades preceding United States independence, Native Americans became important symbols of American identity as colonials attempted to differentiate themselves from the British Empire, despite the increasing displacement and persecution of Indians in the northeastern colonies. Europeans had used images of Indians to signify the North American continent since the 16th century, as demonstrated, for example, by this engraving after Jean van der Straat, depicting Amerigo Vespucci discovering America, represented by a reclining nude Indian woman. Between 1765 and 1783, no less than 65 political prints represented the colonies as Native American, a symbol used 4 times as frequently as other prominent symbols of America, including the snake and the child. Colonists even made Indians victims of the British violence and assault leading up to the Revolution, as visualized in prints like The Able Doctor or American Swallowing the Bitter Draft, published in 1774. So these are British figures forcing North America to drink tea. Colonists frequently donned Indian dress when engaging in acts of political protest, like the Boston Tea Party. So as England became them, for colonists, Indians were adopted as us. However, after the Revolution, the practice of playing Indian became more problematic as the nation moved from rebellion to empire building itself, expanding westward into Indian territory and attempting to consolidate power over the landscape. The Native Americans of Hicks and West's paintings were firmly anchored to a wilderness that had long been cultivated in eastern Pennsylvania by the 1770s, when West began his painting. While the merchants in Penn's treaty are placed near the water, as represented by the Delaware River, which linked them to the Atlantic Ocean and then Europe beyond that, from which their goods originated, the Lenape in these images are resolutely earthbound. Behind the nursing Lenape mother in both of these images stand other Native American figures, including groups that are almost obscured within the shadow of the tall tree in the background. So I'm talking about these figures here and figures that are under the tree in the background of West painting here. The Quakers and British merchants are all clearly associated with the mobility of the ocean, the transformation of the landscape through development and construction, and the manufacture and dissemination of products of industry, visualized by the crates and bolts of cloth. The Native Americans, however, are connected to the dark wilderness that recedes to the left or right, depending on which painting you're looking at of the scene. So West and Hicks position their native protagonists as if they arrived from the dark, shadowy forest in which they will inevitably retreat once the trade is complete. The European settlers, in contrast, are already staking their claim on the land behind them through development and building. Such a scene secures their right to the land, as they are presented as more capable of utilizing it and transforming it, illuminating a fundamental difference in European and Lenape perceptions of land ownership. The Lenape, primarily hunters and gatherers, conceived of property rights in terms of active use for specific purposes, rather than that of static possession and perpetuity. In their early land transactions with Swedish, Dutch, and English colonists, the Lenape likely thought they were merely allowing settlers to farm, hunt, and build houses on the land. Coming from an agricultural society, however, Europeans saw uncultivated land as wasteful. And provincial law in 17th century Pennsylvania stated that if settlers did not improve their property within 3 years, usually through, of course, farming or developing, the land reverted to the proprietor. To the colonists' eye, only Lenape base camps approximated their definition of occupied land. So by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Pennsylvania colony was increasingly depopulated of Native Americans, as Lenape first moved north to the Susquehanna River and then west to Ohio. After 1750, the gradual withdrawal of British and French military from Indian affairs led to intensified Indian hating in the backcountry and increased self-assertion by colonists through land grabbing and massacres. In 1756, Pennsylvania instituted a bounty for Indian scalps, and 7 years later, 56 white frontiersmen, known as the Paxton Boys, murdered 20 Susquehannock Indians at Conestoga, Pennsylvania. By the 19th century, when Hicks was making his paintings, the Lenape were effectively pushed out of Pennsylvania entirely, although there are communities that thrive in the area today. The carefully crafted myth of Penn's treaty circulated throughout the Atlantic world in other forms after 1810 as relics made from the wood of Penn's treaty elm. And this is actually a part of my dissertation, these relics made after Penn's treaty. So I could go on and on about them, but if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So I'm showing you right now an image of the treaty elm in engraving by William Russell and Thomas Birch from the city of Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania, North America, as it appeared in the year 1800. So this was a volume of engravings by the Birches, so father and son engravers, showcasing different parts of Philadelphia. And so this is showing the city and port from Kensington. So from some like Fishtown area, Kensington in Philadelphia. And this large tree here is the treaty elm. So this tree, under which it was believed Penn made his treaty with the Lenape, fell down in a storm in March of 1810. Newspapers from Vermont to South Carolina reported the ancient tree's demise. Quote, "The celebrated tree, having stood the blast of more than a century since that memorable event, is at length prostrated to the dust." End quote. Following its fall, the elm's wood was collected and preserved as fragments or converted into various artifacts. So I'm showing you here just a selection of different relics made out of the wood of Penn's treaty. So here on the left is an urn by the artist, the carver George McGrath, and this was actually shown with another urn that is at the Philadelphia History Museum at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in one of their annual exhibitions. In the center is a bust of William Penn by the ship carver James Laconey. And it's been painted, I love this because the whole reason that this object is important is because it's made with the wood of Penn's, of the treaty elm. But you wouldn't know that because they painted it there's many layers of paint on this object to make it look more like marble, actually. So it's almost like the material that makes it so important is hidden beneath all these layers of paint. And then on the right, one of my favorite treaty elm relics is a hunk, just a whole hunk of Penn, the treaty elm that was put on display at Stoke Park in England. So this was the Penn estate, so Thomas Penn's estate in England had a piece of the elm on display. And I love this couple sort of gesturing to it as if they're admiring a classical statue. So these objects were disseminated throughout the nation and even across the Atlantic Ocean to England, as I explained. So notably, Benjamin West did not highlight the elm in his painting of Penn's treaty. There certainly are trees, and I think one could argue that perhaps this one tree here is meant to be the treaty elm, but none of them are of prodigious size as described by some historians of Penn's treaty and William Penn. So viewers of the painting and its associated prints, however, still read and identified the elm in the composition. The Philadelphia historian and antiquarian John Fanning Watson expressed disappointment in West's decision to diminish the great tree, but concluded that, quote, "it is of no weight as painters, like poets, are indulged to make their own drapery and effect," end quote. So Watson reassured his readers that West was well aware of the true locality of Penn's treaty, recalling a story that West related to him about an incident that occurred during the British occupation of Philadelphia. So according to West, soldiers scoured the countryside for firewood, but out of respect for William Penn and the story of the treaty, General John Graves Simcoe ordered a guard of British soldiers to protect the elm from the axe. I don't know if that story is true or not, but what is true is that elms are actually not very useful trees. They don't make good firewood, they're not good for furniture or building or things like that. So actually the reason why some of these elms got to be of significantly advanced age in early America is because they were just left behind by people that were looking for trees and lumber to be used for different purposes. So Hicks' painting, however, created after the tree's demise, so after 1810, when the treaty elm fell down and its relics were being circulated, he gave the tree the elm a greater visibility, I would argue. So it stands out here much more clearly from the surrounding foliage. And indeed, especially looking at, comparing his elm with what could be West's elm, I wonder actually if he did copy this elm from the birch engraving, which was also a very widely circulated set of prints. This print also, and others like it of Philadelphia, were widely circulated at the time, and I'm sure that Hicks was aware of it. As Native Americans became increasingly linked to the past after the Revolution in Anglo-American consciousness, the contemplation of ancient trees like the treaty elm provided a means to conjure up their presence. So Watson, the historian and antiquarian I mentioned earlier, who also, by the way, created his own share of relic objects, and this is another one of my favorite treaty elm relics at the Winterthur Museum. It's this box is made out of wood of the treaty elm and other kind of historic woods from the Philadelphia area. But Watson has also drawn, of course, an image of the treaty elm in the lid of the box, and then it's filled with other relics, so other sort of little bits of history that Watson collected in the area. So he also, of course, person who creates relics like this, also writes poems about history. So he wrote a poem about Penn's treaty elm that conveyed this sentiment. So it's, "But thou," and I'll only quote a couple lines from it. "But thou, broad elm, canst thou tell us naught of forest chieftains and their banished tribes?" So Watson looked to the elm as a repository of memory of Native Americans who had long been forced out of eastern Pennsylvania, positioning elms as silent witnesses to an irrecoverable history. Through its mythic participation in Penn's treaty, an episode that was iconic in local and even national constructed memory as symbolic of peace, virtue, and justice, the wood of the treaty elm became saturated with associated moral values and lessons. Quakers were particularly interested in this history, of course, and treasured these objects, so these relics that broadcast the benefits of peaceful negotiation. So to conclude, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, it looks like, but I contend that Hicks' painting of Penn's treaty, while inarguably invested in preserving and commemorating the memory of William Penn, solidifying social networks, and reinforcing ideological and political values of the young United States and Quakerism, also glossed over Anglo and Native American relationships in the early 19th century, effectively positioning the Lenape as figures relegated to the historical past. Thank you.
Laura, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I didn't know nearly this much about the painting we have in our own collection. So thank you so much for presenting on this topic.
Thank you. It was fun. It was fun to work on. It's, like I said, this kind of builds upon research I've done in the past, but I actually hadn't looked much, that closely at Hicks' paintings of Penn's tree, so it gave me the opportunity to do that.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. But I can start and just ask, do you want to speak a little to if there are additional things in that research that you discovered while working on this talk?
Well, I mean, I think I was really, and I'm still sort of taken with this idea of the way that he physically, Hicks physically demarcated space and separated these different, his painted scenes with us, like with us as viewers, or separated them from us. It wasn't something that I had thought of before, but when I was looking more closely at this painting, I was like, that's weird. Like, why is he doing that? And I haven't found anything written that explains it very effectively for me. So that's why I brought in Leonardo da Vinci, for example. And I just wonder if he was thinking about those past traditions, because those paintings, by Leonardo and by other Renaissance artists, like I said, were created at a moment when religious imagery was debated very, very heatedly. It was, I think Leonardo da Vinci's painting is prior to the heyday of the Counter-Reformation, but those debates were still happening at that time. So artists were thinking about like how can I present these images in a way that's not blasphemous? And I know Hicks was thinking about those issues as well as a Quaker minister.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, I see it now that you pointed out, right? Of course.
Yeah. And I wonder if there might be more of it under the frame. I kind of wonder if the frame's I don't know if the frame's covering anything up, but you can see here in this chip in the frame that there is some painting underneath. So the frame might be overlaying more of that hole, but I'm not sure.
I don't know if anyone was expecting Leonardo da Vinci to work into Edward Hicks. So
no, I wasn't expecting it either. And then when I was writing this, I was like, I feel like I need to bring some Renaissance. So happens sometimes.
A couple questions, or one that's just a comment from one of our guests tonight who just wanted to thank you and say that this brought her back to art history classes in college. And even though she's in Massachusetts now, she's from PA and learned a lot. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Janine. That's very nice.
You knew who it was, yes.
I can see, I'm looking at them.
And then we also have a question asking, so if the elm, the treaty elm you're talking about is real, but is the treaty and the event not quite real or not as depicted?
Yes. So that is great. So, and that's a good question, and it kind of encapsulates what this sort of fraught history around this subject. So there was an elm tree in Kensington that fell down in 1810 that was believed to be the elm under which William Penn had this treaty with the Lenape Indians. We don't know if that's really the case, because we don't know if the treaty happened, or at least in the way that it's represented by West and Hicks. And we also don't know if it did happen, if it happened under that elm. I think that that elm tree took on that reference because it was such an old tree. Because again, elms are sort of useless trees. And if you go kind of up into New England, there's countless references of these old elms that became, that dominated the center of different towns that came up in New England too, because again, they were left behind because they were hard to cut down, they weren't very useful. So I think this elm took on those connotations. I don't think it became associated with the treaty, or at least this kind of myth of the treaty, until the 18th century, so later in the 18th century, prior to West painting, but still later than 1682, when it was believed that Penn's treaty happened, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yes, but there's a lot of myth making. Like I said this in the presentation, but really West painting of Penn's treaty really became what people understood Penn's treaty to be, and that his painting was created 100 years after the actual event. So it's not a documentary work in any way.
So to add on to that, we have another question about something about kind of this similar topic, asking, if this event never actually took place or wasn't exactly like this, do you think that the painting was to control the narrative around the interactions between the settlers and the Lenape people?
Yes. It's a form of propaganda in a lot of ways. And as I said, in the 18th century and in the early 19th century, colonists and Anglo-American interactions with the Lenape were not good. And this was a way to kind of look back to a past, again, very much a mythic past, but with these rose-colored glasses. Like it wasn't always this way, and it doesn't have to be this way, but it was that way at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know if you can easily get to the slide where you have the Hicks painting next to Benjamin West's painting.
Yes.
But perfect.
That
was the wrong one. Sorry. The question is, so in the Hicks painting, the Native American woman in white seems to be wearing very sophisticated clothing. reminding our guest of the royal robes in 18th century paintings.
Mhm.
It seems more ornate than the comparable garment in the West painting. And do you have any indication as if there's a reason for this?
I don't know if there's a reason for it. It is interesting though that of course, and it would be fun just to go, you know, and I did a little bit of this, but I'm sure there's many more differences between these two works that we could kind of unpack. But in West painting, it's a child too that's sitting with the woman who's nursing this young child. But here in Hicks painting, it's more of like another adult figure. It doesn't to me look like a child. And I kind of wonder, so in West painting, I've always interpreted this fabric as being like fabric that's already been traded for from the Quakers. So you can see, you know, there's a figure here with green who's kind of carrying some fabric away with him again, like into the wilderness. Like I said, sort of like, you know, you're retreating back to this kind of, you know, wilderness was very much a dark, shadowy, mysterious place in the late 18th century. A place to be avoided. Yeah, so I think that this fabric is European fabric that Wes is representing. This blue fabric here in Hicks seems to be similar to the blue fabric this one figure's wearing. I don't know why he made the substitution for white necessarily. I don't think he's making, you know, trying to make this an angelic figure in any way, but I'm not sure. So I'm not entirely sure. I don't see actually really much yellow. So this figure's wearing yellow. I don't see yellow in Hicks painting. I wonder if he, you know, Quakers, again, no, Quakers were sort of against this kind of imagery overall. They also were were also against really flashy fabric colors as well. Because it went against this idea of plainness and utilitarianism. So I'm wondering if his palette has just been adjusted so it doesn't include, you know, some of the richer colors in West painting. But I'm just speculating there.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think you're right. We could play a very intellectual game of, can you spot the differences between the paintings?
Yeah, so there's quite a few. Yeah, there's quite a few. And one thing I didn't talk about, so in West painting too, like some of these buildings are literally under construction. But the buildings in Hicks painting are pretty much finished and completed. You know, like there's just kind of like little, although maybe this building in the background, maybe there's, I can't tell actually in this image if there's scaffolding on the roof or just a frame for the roof.
And a thank you from Vaughn, who is one of our staff members, saying that you were touching on it, but he was going to ask what the significance of the cloth is that's being shown. And I think you kind of, you know, mentioned the bolts of cloth and the possible trading interaction there.
Yes, and I might not have, I guess I didn't cover that necessarily in the presentation, but it's believed, so West is showing that this is an exchange, right? So we will give you this cloth if you give us our land. And it's, you know, here we have this wonderful visual symmetry in both of the paintings. So you have this unfurling bolt of cloth being presented to the Lenape, and then William Penn is gesturing to that with one hand and gesturing to this unfurling scroll on the other hand. So it's like these two sort of unrolling objects are being almost like a balance, right? With the way, especially the Penn is holding out his hands. And in some interpretations of these works are also about how mention how, you know, the Lenape are here, they're distracted by these material goods, and, you know, they're not getting the better end of the deal necessarily in this exchange. But again, this is there's no evidence that this sort of exchange actually occurred.
Interesting. One question, is there reference to the Lenape experience of the Penn Treaty anywhere that you found in your research?
There is a little bit, in that there is no reference to history. So there is, I read in my research for my dissertation, I was trying to find more of that. And it was interesting. So there is no like treaty elm or kind of this like singular event in the Lenape tradition, at least none that I've seen in my research. And actually, what I found that was interesting is the reference, some of the Lenape sort of oral history that I was reading was describing trees like elms as almost like barriers to pathways and waterways and things like that. So that even the idea of trees as something, as a place where groups come together underneath branches of trees, was something that the Lenape didn't even adhere to necessarily. So it just didn't have the same sort of impact, at least in accounts that I've seen sort of from earlier periods. Now I think it might be different, just because of West painting has really just perpetuated this this myth through a variety of communities. I've actually, so I mentioned this as part of my dissertation research, but I could also see this as being a potential exhibition that I'd like to do someday at the Michener. We have a new director actually now, Kate Quinn, who is coming to us from the Penn Museum, and she has she's experienced working with local Lenape community leaders and is very eager to kind of bring about these greater discussions. So that's something I'm really looking forward to as I try to move this project forward.
Yeah. And just your fun Henry Mercer fact of the day for anyone who wanted one is that he was at one point the curator of the museum at the University of Pennsylvania that we now call the Penn Museum.
Mm-hmm.
So I unfortunately don't know the answer to this. You may. Do you have an idea of what the kind of wood is that makes up the frame of the painting? And
I don't.
A question of, is it perhaps elm?
Wouldn't that be wonderful? I can't believe I didn't think of that. I don't know. It doesn't look like elm though to me. To me, it looks like almost like a mahogany, but I'm not sure. I don't know. Are there any staff members tuning in that know the answer?
If they do, please put it in the Q&A. I don't personally, but I can absolutely find out. And if it's
I'd be curious.
I will be giving you a call.
Yeah, that would be wonderful if it was framed with wood from the treaty elm. Gosh, I can't believe I didn't think about that as a possibility. But it doesn't really look like elm to me unless it's been really highly varnished.
The question said that other paintings of his have a cherry wood veneer. So
okay, that seems to match up better.
So a question from Peter, saying that he knows that printed material done in Quaker Run, Pennsylvania had to be approved before it was finished. What was the Quaker reaction to the West painting? And what, if any, reaction was there from Penn's family and or the Quaker community to the Hicks painting?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I have like a set Quaker response to West painting. I know because it was so widely circulated that it was generally accepted. I don't know of any criticism of it. It was commissioned, so West painting was commissioned by William Penn's son, Thomas Penn, so he approved of the painting. And in terms of for Hicks, so he, as I said, he really created his easel paintings, we believe, primarily for friends and other people connected to his ministry. And as far as we can tell, that they were brought into various homes. I mean, there's quite a few that survive. So I would argue that they were generally approved, although, as I said, I think there probably was always a tension within Quakerism about these images. Like, are they appropriate? Again, I think Hicks was thinking about ways to kind of make compromises around that. But as I said, even though Quakerism frowned upon images like this, people were still collecting them and purchasing them and displaying them in their homes. But I believe these, especially William Penn, this images around William Penn, I think probably very strongly resonated with the Quaker community because Penn was such an important figure in that religion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't have any other questions. So if anyone has any last minute questions, please put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm getting some
Yeah, thank
thank
you.
yous for an interesting presentation. So I know that our guests enjoyed your presentation tonight. So thank you very much for that. They're all rolling in now. Many thanks.
Well, thank you. This is really wonderful. And I appreciate all the thoughtful questions and feedback.
And you know, you said the possibility of another talk about William Lathrop's painting. So
Oh, maybe. I know. I just love that giant painting. When I came around the corner in the exhibition and saw it, I was like, what is this? This giant Lathrop
very
painting.
large.
It's very cool.
So thank you all so much for being here tonight. If anyone on this call hasn't been able to make it to the Mercer Museum and see the exhibition in person, I hope you'll have a chance before it closes at the end of the year. And thank you, Laura, so much for this talk tonight. And it's wonderful to have such great neighbors across the street at the Michener who know so much about art that we can have an art exhibit here and play on your expertise. So thank you so much. And everyone enjoy your evenings. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everybody.